In order to better understand social stratification, it is useful to examine various historical periods and to make global comparisons across cultures. So today we're going to look at three major systems of stratification: slavery, caste, and social class. Slavery is the most extreme system of social stratification, and it relegates people to the status of property, mainly for the purpose of providing labor for the slave owner. Slaves can then be bought and sold like any other commodity. They aren't paid for their labor and in fact are forced to work under mental or physical threat. Occupying the lowest rank in the social hierarchy, slaves have none of the rights common to free members of the same societies in which they live. Slavery has been practiced since the earliest times and has continued for millennia in South America, Europe, and the United States. Sometimes the race, nationality, or religion of the slave owners was the same as that of the slaves, as was the case in ancient Greece and Rome. Historically, a person could become enslaved in one of several ways. One way was through debt. A person who couldn't repay what he owed might be taken into slavery by his creditor. Another way was through warfare. Groups of vanquished soldiers might become slaves to the victors. And the women and children of the losing side could also be taken into slavery. A person who was caught committing a crime could become a slave as a kind of punishment and as a means of compensating the victim. And some slaves were captured and kidnapped, as in the case of the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas. Slavery as an economic system was profitable for the slave owner. In most systems of slavery, people were slaves for life, doing work in agricultural, construction, mining, or domestic service, and sometimes in the military, industry, or commerce. Their children would also become slaves, thus making the owner a great profit. In some systems, however, slavery was temporary, and some slaves could buy their own freedom. Slavery is now prohibited by every nation in the world, as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not only is it illegal, but it is considered immoral as well. Nevertheless, the shocking fact is that slavery continues to exist today in such places as India, South Asia, West Africa, and many other places around the world in the form of child soldiers, serfdom, forced and bonded laborers, human trafficking, and sex slaves. America and the Western world are not exempt from these same shocking practices either, where people are held as agricultural, domestic, and sex slaves. The National Human Trafficking Hotline reported over 5,000 cases of slavery in the United States in 2016 alone. More than 80% of those cases involved sexual slavery, and more than 30% occurred in just 3 states. Americans also play an indirect role in supporting slavery elsewhere in the world by means of our material appetites and the type of labor utilized in certain countries to satisfy our various consumer demands. Using a somewhat broader definition of slavery that includes all of the above, plus other conditions such as forced marriage, debt bondage, and the sale or exploitation of children, researchers at the Walk Free Foundation believe there are more than 40 million people trapped in some form of modern slavery. That is more enslaved people in terms of total numbers than at any other time in human history. Caste represents another type of social stratification found in various parts of the world. The traditional caste system is based on heredity, which means whole groups of people are born into a certain strata. Castes may be differentiated along religious, economic, or political lines, as well as by skin color or other physical characteristics. The caste system creates a highly stratified society where there's little or no chance of a person changing her position within the hierarchy, no matter what she may achieve individually. Members must marry within their own group, and their caste ranking is passed on to their children. In general, members of higher-ranking castes tend to be more prosperous, whereas members of lower-ranking castes tend to have fewer material resources, live in abject poverty, and suffer discrimination. India is the country most closely associated with the caste system, based there in the Hindu religion. The caste system ranks individuals into one of 5 categories: Brahmin, who are scholars and priests; Kshatriya or Kshetri, rulers and warriors; Vaisya, merchants and traders; Sudra, who are farmers, artisans, and laborers; and the untouchables, or social outcasts. The caste system is a reflection of what Hindus call karma, the complex moral law of cause and effect that governs the universe. According to this belief, membership in a particular caste is seen as a well-deserved reward or punishment for virtuous or sinful behavior in a past life. Caste is thus considered a spiritual rather than material status, but it still results in real-world inequalities. Caste-related segregation and discrimination were prohibited in 1949 by India's constitution, but they're still prevalent. Resistance to social change remains, and thus far the social ramifications of the caste system have not been completely dismantled. An interesting example of the caste system was apartheid, a legal separation of racial and ethnic groups that was enforced between 1948 and 1991 in South Africa. The term itself literally means apartness in Afrikaans and Dutch. The consequence of apartheid was to create a great disparity among those in different strata of society. South Africans were legally classified into four main racial groups: white, Indian, colored, and black. The whites were from English and Dutch heritage. Indians were from India. The coloreds were a mixed race, and then black. Blacks formed a large majority, at 60% of the population. These groups were geographically and socially separated from one another. Blacks were forcibly removed from almost 80% of the country, which was reserved for the three minority groups, and were relocated to independent homelands, similar to the Indian reservations in the United States. They could not enter other parts of the country without a pass, usually in order to work as guest laborers in white areas. Ironically, African Americans visiting South Africa were given honorary white status and could move freely within the country. Social services for whites and non-whites were separate as well. Schools, hospital, buses, parks, beaches, libraries, theaters, public restrooms, and even graveyards were segregated. Indians and colors were also discriminated against, though they usually led slightly more privileged lives than blacks. Despite claims of separate but equal, the standard of living among whites far exceeded that of any other group. In South Africa, under the apartheid system, whites held all the political, economic, and social power, despite being a numerical minority. It was not long before the civil unrest and resistance to the system began developing within South Africa and among the international community. Blacks and even some whites began to organize wage strikes and demonstrations, and sanctions were imposed by Western nations. The plights of high-profile anti-apartheid leaders such as Steve Biko and Nelson Mandela became known worldwide. Pressure on the white government continued to grow until the country was in an almost constant state of emergency. In 1991, apartheid as a legal institution was finally abolished. Its legacy, however, has been much more difficult to dismantle. It has been over 20 years since democratic elections in which all South African citizens could participate were first held in 1994. And still change is happening very slowly. Although non-whites now share the same rights and privileges as whites, social inequality and discrimination have decreased little. South Africa remains a country with one of the most unequal distributions of income in the world. The wealthiest 10% of the population earn nearly 60% of the nation's total income. This upper economic strata is almost exclusively composed of whites, a group that makes up just under 9% of South Africa's total population. Though black incomes and employment rates have improved, a large income gap remains, with the rich and especially the already rich whites getting richer. On average, whites are still paid 6 times more than blacks. There are other measures of wealth inequality that persist as well. Whites still own around 70% of the land in South Africa, despite promises to redistribute 30% of that land to blacks. The restoration of land seized during apartheid is only slowly being accomplished and at a price to those making claims. Similar inequalities between whites and other races in South Africa are present in education, healthcare, and the criminal justice system. In some new ways, new patterns of class stratification are replacing rather than erasing old patterns of racial stratification. Law professor and civil rights attorney Michelle Alexander argues that there is a similar caste system in the United States, but that it operates through the criminal justice system. While it no longer legal or socially acceptable to discriminate against people based on race, we still allow discrimination based on criminal convictions. In other words, felons are denied many of their citizenship rights, including voting in many states, even after they've been released from prison. And since Black men are disproportionately represented in the prison population, they are also disproportionately affected by felon disenfranchisement and the lifelong stigmatization associated with the identity of the ex-con. Alexander argues that an extraordinary percentage of Black men in the United States are legally barred from voting today, just as they have been throughout most of American history. They are also subject to legalized discrimination in employment, housing, education, public benefits, and jury service, just as their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were. Instead of slavery or the segregation laws of the Jim Crow era, Alexander writes, discriminatory criminal laws and the unfair justice system enforce racial inequality in the United States today. Social class, a system of stratification practiced primarily in capitalist societies, ranks groups of people according to their wealth, property, power, and prestige. It is also referred to by sociologists as socioeconomic status, or SES, to keep in mind the social as well as the economic basis of this system of stratification. The social class system is much less rigid than the caste system. Although children tend to inherit the social class of their parents, during the course of a lifetime they can move up or down levels in the strata. Strictly speaking, social class is not based on race, ethnicity, gender, or age, although, as we will see, there's often an overlap between class and other variables. It's important to recognize that while social statistics often address issues of inequality one variable at a time, social actors do not. In other words, we experience our lives not just as middle class or working class or upper class people, but as women and men, blacks, whites, Latinos, and Asians, college or high school graduates, Christians, Jews, or Muslims, spouses or singles, and so on. Our lived experience is one of intersectionality, a concept that acknowledges that multiple dimensions of status and inequality intersect to shape who we are and how we live. Our life chances are influenced by our class and our race and our gender and our religion and our age and multiple other categories, all together, not one at a time. An example of this can be seen in the ethnographic research of sociologist Karen Lacey, who studied Black middle-class suburbanites in the Washington, D.C. region. As Lacey's findings show, social status is more complex than just a middle-class salary might indicate. Her respondents' identities were shared by their income, occupation, residential status, and race. In fact, many reported being frustrated as they tried to convince others that they were among the middle class in the first place. Their race obscured their class in the eyes of whites and made it difficult for whites to see them as belonging in certain neighborhoods or business establishments at all. This is an example of how, in the reality of everyday life, race and class are experienced as inseparable. Their effects on our experiences are intertwined, even as we attempt to unravel them in different units in a sociology class. Keep this concept of intersectionality in mind as we continue learning about class, and then again in subsequent units when we address other forms of social inequality. Sociologists are not always in agreement about what determines class standing or where the boundaries are between different social classes. We'll consider some of these disagreements later after we talk about the United States and its class system.